The Gilded Scepter was not a restaurant. It was a mausoleum dedicated to the worship of capital. The air itself felt heavy, thick with the scent of old money, expensive leather, and the earthy, almost aggressive aroma of black truffles being shaved over plates of meticulously arranged food. The silence was not peaceful but profound, a carefully curated absence of noise broken only by the reverent clinking of silver cutlery against fine porcelain and the hushed conspiratorial murmurs of men who moved markets with a single word. Light did not illuminate the room so much as it dripped from colossal crystal chandeliers, casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the dark mahogany walls and gilded accents. Each table was an island, a private kingdom where dynasties were forged and fortunes were dismantled. And moving between these islands, a ghost in a starched black uniform, was Alara Vance. Her movements were a study in practiced invisibility, a fluid economy of motion that allowed her to refill a water glass or clear a plate without ever truly being seen. She was a function, not a person, a silent cog in the grand, opulent machine. Within the fortress of her professional composure, however, Alara lived a different life, one of stark, brutal contrast to the gilded cage she served. The scent of truffles was constantly at war with the memory of antiseptic that clung to the halls of her father's long-term care facility, a scent she could never quite wash away. The gentle clinking of champagne flutes was an echo of the rhythmic, metallic beep of the heart monitor that was the constant soundtrack to her visits. Her father, once a brilliant engineer whose laughter could fill a house, was now a hollowed-out version of himself, his mind and body shattered by a stroke brought on by the shock of absolute financial ruin. The men dining here tonight, men who spoke of multi-million-dollar deals as casually as they ordered wine, had no concept of the crushing weight of the $7,000 in medical bills that landed on her small apartment's doormat every single month. They saw a waitress. They did not see the daughter carrying the weight of a fallen giant on her shoulders. Her smile, a meticulously constructed piece of armor against a world that had taken everything. Before the fall, before the uniform and the famed deference, Alara had been a different person, living in a world of light and color. She was on the cusp of completing her master's degree in developmental psychology and art therapy, her name already whispered with a kind of reverence in academic circles. Her thesis on nonverbal communication in children on the autism spectrum was considered revolutionary. She had a gift, an almost preternatural ability to see the world not in words but in shapes, textures, and the silent frequencies of human emotion. She could look at a person and see the architecture of their inner life, the cracks in their foundation, the load-bearing walls of their deepest fears and desires. Now she used that gift to anticipate if a customer wanted more bread or needed their check. She watched the powerful men in their tailored suits, seeing past the expensive fabrics to the brittle anxiety, the gnawing ambition, and the profound loneliness that sat with them at their tables for one. Her once promising future had been traded for this, a life of silent observation from the margins. The atmosphere in the restaurant shifted, a subtle but palpable change in barometric pressure, the way the air changes just before a storm. Marco Valeriano did not simply enter a room, he conquered it. He moved with a predatory grace, his bespoke charcoal suit fitting him like a second skin, a Patek Philippe watch gleaming on his wrist like a shackle made of captured starlight. He was followed by a nervous maitre d', who seemed to shrink in his presence. Marco's eyes, the color of cold slate, swept the room with an air of dismissive ownership, cataloging everything and valuing nothing. He didn't see the history in the woodwork or the artistry in the chandeliers. He saw assets. Trailing in his wake was a small boy, Leo, his son. The boy was a stark counterpoint to his father's overwhelming presence, a small, silent planet caught in the gravitational pull of a dying star. He clutched a large, empty sketchbook to his chest, his gaze fixed on the floor, utterly disconnected from the world his father so effortlessly dominated. The stage is set for a confrontation that will change everything. We're about to travel to the heart of New York City, But first, we'd love to know where this story is reaching you today. Comment your location below, and be sure to subscribe to join our community. Marco and his associate, a man whose sycophantic smile seemed surgically attached to his face, settled into the best table in the house. Their conversation immediately began. A low, brutalist hum of corporate warfare. Words like leveraging, hostile takeover, and liquidation were deployed like artillery shells. Marco spoke of ruining a competitor with the same detached, clinical tone one might use to describe a chess move. Throughout it all, Leo remained silent, a ghost at the feast. He placed his pristine sketchbook on the table, its pages a vast, empty white desert. He held a pencil, but his hands remained still. Marco glanced at his son with a flicker of annoyance, a momentary crack in his iron facade. The boy was a problem he couldn't solve, a variable his immense wealth couldn't control, and it irritated him. Ilara watched from across the room, her heart aching not for the powerful man, but for the silent child adrift in a sea of his father's ambition. Her station assignment meant she had to serve their table. Ilara took a deep, steadying breath, reinforcing the invisible armor she wore. She approached with the quiet efficiency that was her trademark, her steps making no sound on the thick Persian rug. She poured their water from a heavy crystal pitcher, the liquid catching the light as it fell. Her movements were precise, impersonal. But as she placed a glass in front of Leo, her eyes met his for a fraction of a second. She offered him a small, almost imperceptible smile, not the practiced smile of a waitress, but something genuine, a flicker of the therapist she used to be. It was a simple human gesture, a quiet acknowledgement of his presence. It was also a catastrophic mistake. It was an act of seeing someone Marco Valeriano had deemed invisible, and in his world, such transgressions did not go unpunished. Marco noticed the smile. He stopped mid-sentence, a cruel amusement twisting the corner of his mouth. He didn't look at Ilara. He never would. Instead, he turned to his partner, gesturing vaguely in her direction with a dismissive wave of his hand, as if shooing away an insect. "Look at this," he said, his voice a low, contemptuous drawl that carried across the hushed restaurant. "She thinks a warm smile can fix what a dozen specialists and $100,000 in therapy can't. What would a waitress possibly know about a mind like his?" The words hung in the air, each one a perfectly polished stone of cruelty. The associate chuckled on cue, a dry, rasping sound. For Marco, she was less than nothing, a backdrop for his casual display of power. But for Ilara, the insult was a key, turning in a lock she had kept sealed for years. The image of her father's face, slack and confused in a hospital bed, flooded her mind. She could hear the drone of the machines that kept him alive, could feel the cold linoleum floor beneath her feet. This man, with his casual disdain and soulless ambition, was the same archetype as the monster who had broken her family. A fury, cold and solid as glacial ice, began to form in her veins, steadying her hands and slowing her breath. The humiliation was complete. Marco had already moved on, launching into the sordid details of a new predatory deal, confident that the waitress was too insignificant, too simple to comprehend the financial jargon he was using. He mentioned the strategic dismantling of a small, ethical firm, a necessary culling of the weak, he called it. The name of the company he mentioned was Vance Engineering, her father's company. The air was sucked from Ilara's lungs. The silver tray in her hand suddenly felt as if it weighed 1,000 pounds. It was him. The man who had just fired a shot at her dignity was the same man who had destroyed her entire world. She stood perfectly still, a statue carved from compressed rage and grief. Her professional mask remained flawlessly in place, but behind her eyes, a fire had been lit. The invisible waitress was gone. In her place stood a woman who now had a name for her pain, a face for her enemy, and a reason to fight back. The game had just begun. The world did not shatter. It simply went silent. The distant, reverent clinking of silverware, the murmur of powerful men discussing the fate of nations and markets, the very hum of the opulent air conditioning, it all receded into a profound, bottomless quiet. For Ilara, the universe had contracted to the space of a single heartbeat, a single, searing truth. Vance Engineering. The name echoed not in her ears, but in the hollowed-out chambers of her heart, a name she had not heard spoken by a stranger in years. It was the name of her father's dream, the edifice of his life's work, the legacy he had built with calloused hands and a brilliant mind. And this man, this titan of industry with hands as soft as his morals were hard, had spoken it with the casual disdain of a man flicking a piece of dust from his sleeve. The silver tray in her hand did not tremble. It became an extension of her own sudden, rigid stillness. The cold fury that had begun as a mere trickle in her veins now solidified into something dense and heavy, a core of tempered steel forming around her spine. She was no longer a waitress. She was no longer a victim. She was a witness. Her training, the years spent decoding the silent language of the human soul, took over. Her breath, which should have been a ragged gasp of shock and grief, became slow, deep, and measured. Her vision, which should have been blurred with tears, sharpened with an almost predatory clarity. She saw everything. She saw the nervous tick in the associate's eye, a man terrified of his master's shifting moods. She saw the way Marco Valeriano held his wine glass, his thumb rubbing the stem in a repetitive, self-soothing gesture that betrayed a deep-seated need for control. Most importantly, she saw the boy, Leo. He was the epicenter of the silence, a small, still point in his father's chaotic orbit. He wasn't looking at his father, or the sycophantic guest. His gaze was fixed on the condensation, trailing down the side of a crystal water pitcher, his focus absolute. He was not empty. He was simply observing a different world, a world of light and physics and quiet beauty that the men at his table were blind to. In that small, silent boy, Ilara saw a reflection of her own father's mind before it was broken, a place of intricate, beautiful machinery that the world had no patience for. The decision was not a conscious thought. It was an instinct, a reflex born of years of empathy and a sudden, all-consuming need for justice. She placed the heavy silver tray on a nearby service station, her movements unhurried and deliberate. The sound of the metal meeting the polished wood was the only noise that broke the spell. A soft, definitive thud that caused the associate to glance up, startled. Ilara ignored him. She ignored the manager who was now watching her from across the room, with a growing sense of alarm. She began to walk toward Marco Valeriano's table. She was no longer gliding with the practiced invisibility of a servant. Each step was grounded, purposeful. She was not approaching a customer, she was approaching a subject. The starched black uniform felt less like a costume of servitude, and more like the sober professional attire of a clinician about to perform a delicate and necessary procedure. The rage inside her was not hot and chaotic. It was a cold, clean energy, a powerful fuel that sharpened her senses and clarified her purpose. She was not here for revenge. She was here to reveal a truth. She stopped not at Marco's side, but beside Leo. She did not look at the father, refusing to grant him the power of her attention. She knelt, a gesture that in any other context would have seemed subservient, but here, it was an act of leveling. She brought herself down to the boy's world, entering his field of vision without aggression. She didn't speak immediately. She simply followed his gaze to the water pitcher, seeing what he saw. She saw the way the light from the chandeliers fractured through the crystal, splitting into 1,000 tiny rainbows on the white tablecloth. She saw the perfect spherical droplets of condensation clinging to the glass, each one a miniature world. She understood. After a moment of shared, silent observation, she spoke, her voice so low it was almost a whisper, intended only for the boy. It was not the voice of a waitress. It was the calm, resonant tone of a therapist, a voice designed to build bridges across chasms of silence. "The light is hitting the water glass just so," she murmured, her words a simple observation, not a question or a command. "It holds all the colors, doesn't it? Like it caught a star." For a long moment, nothing happened. Marco watched, a sneer of disbelief hardening his features. He opened his mouth to unleash a fresh torrent of scorn, to have this impertinent woman thrown out on the street. But the words died in his throat. Leo, who had not responded to a direct prompt in years, slowly lifted his head. His eyes, dark and profoundly intelligent, shifted from the picture to Ilara's face. He saw no pity there, no condescension, only a quiet, shared understanding. Then he looked down at the pristine, empty sketchbook and the perfectly sharpened pencil lying beside it. His small hand, which had been resting limply on the table, reached for the pencil. His grip was not tentative. It was firm, sure. He pulled the sketchbook closer, his movements economical and precise. A profound silence fell over the table, a silence now thick with astonishment. The associate's jaw hung slightly agape. Marco's sneer had vanished, replaced by a look of stunned, utter disbelief. The boy, his son, who lived in a world without words or images, was about to draw. The sound of the graphite pencil touching the paper was like a thunderclap in the silent room. Leo's hand began to move, not with the hesitant strokes of a child, but with a speed and confidence that was breathtaking. It was a torrent, a floodgate of stored observation and emotion bursting forth. His eyes were no longer on the water pitcher or on Ilara. They were focused inward, looking at something stored deep within his memory, a perfectly preserved image he was now pulling into the light. The pencil flew across the page, a frantic, controlled dance of shadow and light. Lines formed, curves took shape, and an image began to emerge from the blank white desert of the page. It was a face. Ilara remained kneeling, a silent guardian of the moment, her presence a shield against the world's intrusion. She recognized the technique. It was photorealistic memory recall, a rare gift, often found in savants who perceive the world with a level of detail that is overwhelming to most. He wasn't just drawing, he was transcribing a piece of his soul. Marco Valeriano was frozen, a statue of a man carved from shock. He had spent a fortune on the world's most renowned specialists. He had subjected his son to a battery of tests, therapies, and experimental treatments, all of which had yielded nothing. He had tried to solve the problem of his son's silence the way he solved every problem, by throwing an obscene amount of money at it. He had demanded a result, an outcome, a return on his investment. And every specialist had failed, leaving him with a gnawing sense of impotence. A failure so profound, it was the one thing in his life he could not conquer or acquire his way out of. Now a waitress in a cheap uniform, a woman he had dismissed as less than human, had achieved in 30 seconds what his millions had failed to do in 3 years. The revelation was not just shocking, it was an indictment. It was a judgment on his entire worldview, a declaration that the power he worshipped was, in this one crucial arena, utterly worthless. The frantic scratching of the pencil ceased. The sudden silence was as startling as the noise had been. Leo's hand fell away from the page, his small chest rising and falling with the effort. He blinked, as if waking from a long dream. For a moment, he just stared at the completed drawing, his own creation, a mystery even to him. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he turned the sketchbook around and pushed it across the table toward his father. The image he revealed was not merely a drawing, it was a resurrection. It was the face of a woman, rendered with a level of detail and emotional depth that was almost impossible to believe. Every strand of hair, every laugh line around her eyes, the specific, gentle curve of her smile, it was all there. It was a perfect, heartbreakingly accurate portrait of Isabella Valeriano, Marco's late wife, Leo's mother. The boy had not just drawn her face, he had captured her essence, the warmth and light that had been extinguished from their lives years ago. The air left Marco's lungs in a single, ragged gasp. He stared at the portrait of his wife, his mind struggling to reconcile the image with the reality of its creation. It was her. It was the way she looked on their last vacation in Tuscany, the sun in her hair, a secret smile playing on her lips. It was a memory he himself was starting to lose, the edges blurring with time and grief. But his son, his silent, disconnected son, had held it perfectly preserved within him all this time. A tremor started in Marco's hand as he reached for the sketchbook. His fingers, which signed checks for billions of dollars without a second thought, trembled as they touched the paper. A single, hot tear escaped his eye and traced a path down his cheek, a traitor to the iron control he so carefully maintained. It was a crack in the dam, and behind it was a reservoir of grief he had kept locked away for years. The man who moved markets and crushed competitors was, in this moment, just a husband mourning his wife, a father seeing a ghost. But the moment of raw human vulnerability was fleeting. For a man like Marco Valeriano, such a profound loss of control, especially in front of a subordinate and a business associate, was an intolerable humiliation. The grief was real, but the shame was more powerful. The tear on his cheek felt like a brand. This waitress, this nobody, had not only succeeded where he had failed, but she had also borne witness to his weakness. She had seen behind the curtain, and that was a transgression that could not be forgiven. The shattered grief in his eyes instantly hardened, cooling into something sharp and brutal. The sorrow curdled into pure, unadulterated rage. He shoved the sketchbook away as if it had burned him, the beautiful portrait of his wife now a symbol of his own inadequacy. He shot to his feet, the force of his movement rattling the table and sending silverware clattering against porcelain. His face was a mask of thunderous fury. He didn't look at Alara. To look at her now would be to acknowledge her power. Instead, he bellowed for the manager, his voice a roar that silenced the entire restaurant. Giraud, the manager, a perpetually nervous man named Jean-Pierre Giraud, scurried over, his face pale with dread. Marco pointed a trembling, accusatory finger in Alara's direction, his voice dripping with venom. "Get her out of my sight," he snarled, the words low and dangerous. "I don't care how you do it. Just get her out of here. She's fired. Now." The command was absolute, an imperial decree that allowed for no argument. Giraud flinched as if struck, then turned to Alara, his expression a mixture of fear and apology. He began to stammer, to try and de-escalate, but Marco cut him off with a slice of his hand. "Are you deaf? I said now." The associate at the table was staring at his plate, wishing the floor would swallow him whole, desperate to become invisible in the face of his boss's volcanic eruption. Alara rose to her feet with a quiet dignity that seemed to infuriate Marco even more. She did not plead, she did not cry. She did not offer a single word in her own defense. She simply met the manager's panicked gaze with a look of calm resignation. Her heart was pounding, a frantic drum against her ribs, but her expression remained serene. The loss of her job was a terrifying prospect, a death sentence for her father's care. But in this moment, something else was more important. She had reached a child who everyone else had abandoned. She had proven that her skills, the very ones this world had forced her to bury, were more powerful than all the money and influence in this room. As two security guards, summoned by the frantic manager, began to approach, Marco was already turning away, pulling out his phone, his rage needing a new outlet. He began pacing, barking into the phone at some unfortunate soul on the other end, his voice a low, brutal growl as he tried to reassert his dominance over his shattered world. As the guards gently but firmly took her by the arms to escort her out, their touch surprisingly hesitant, Alara's sharpened senses caught the fragments of Marco's enraged phone call. He was venting, his voice a torrent of corporate savagery, trying to regain his footing by crushing someone else. And then she heard it. Amidst the storm of insults and threats, he spat the name that had started it all. "And if the Vance Engineering acquisition taught me anything," he raged into the phone, "it's that you have to crush these sentimental little family outfits before they even know what's happening. You burn them to the ground. No survivors." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow, a final, damning confirmation. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a similar story. It was him. The man who had just destroyed her present was the very same monster who had annihilated her past. The man who had just fired her for an act of compassion was the architect of her family's ruin. The walk out of the Gilded Scepter was a surreal journey through a world that no longer seemed real. The opulent decor, the hushed whispers of the patrons, the clinking of glasses. It was all the backdrop of a life that was no longer hers. She was being cast out of the gilded cage, but for the first time, she felt free. The cold night air of New York City hit her face as she was deposited unceremoniously on the sidewalk. The heavy oak doors of the restaurant swung shut behind her, sealing her off from that world of power and cruelty. She stood there for a long moment under the dim glow of a street lamp, the sounds of the city a chaotic symphony around her. She had lost her job. The $7,000 medical bill for the month was due in a week. By all accounts, she should have been shattered, a crumpled heap of despair on the cold pavement. But she felt none of that. The glacial fury inside her had been forged into something new, a purpose. She began to walk, her steps sure and steady on the cracked city sidewalk. She was no longer just Alara Vance, the invisible waitress. She was the daughter of a great man who had been wronged. She was the keeper of a sacred memory. And she was a woman who now had a target. The grief that had weighed her down for years had been transmuted into fuel. The fight was no longer about survival. It was about justice. Her mind, once consumed with remembering dinner specials and wine pairings, was now racing, formulating a plan. She knew Marco's weaknesses now. She had seen his profound arrogance, his dismissiveness of those he considered beneath him, and she had seen the one tiny crack in his armor, his son. He had underestimated her. He had assumed she was simple, uneducated, and deaf to the language of his world. That was his fatal mistake. And it was going to be the key to his undoing. Her small apartment felt different when she arrived. It was no longer just a refuge from the world. It was a war room. She walked over to the small, cluttered desk in the corner and picked up a framed photograph. It was of her father, taken years ago, standing proudly in front of the Vance Engineering building. He was smiling, his eyes bright with intelligence and kindness. She traced the outline of his face with her finger, a silent vow passing between them. The time for silent suffering was over. The time for passive resistance was done. She put the photo down and picked up her phone. Her hands were perfectly steady. She scrolled through her contacts, past the names of other waitstaff and agency coordinators, until she found a name she hadn't called in years. Dr. Alistair Finch, her former thesis advisor at Columbia, a man with a brilliant mind, a bulldog's tenacity, and a deep-seated contempt for corporate predators. He had been devastated when she'd dropped out of the program. He would understand. He would help. She pressed the call button, the small electronic tone, a declaration of war. The invisible woman was about to make herself seen. The phone call to Dr. Alistair Finch felt like reaching across a chasm into a life she had been forced to abandon. The ensuing meeting took place in his office at Columbia University, a room that seemed to exist outside of time. It was a chaotic sanctuary of the mind, a space that smelled of aging paper, pipe tobacco, and the faint, sweet scent of brewing Earl Grey tea. Books were not merely stored on shelves. They formed precarious, teetering towers on every available surface, spilling from the desk, the floor, and even the windowsills, creating a labyrinth of human thought. Dust motes danced in the shafts of late afternoon light, illuminating a world of anthropological artifacts, geological specimens, and framed academic commendations that hung slightly askew. Dr. Finch himself was much like his office, a bit rumpled, slightly disorganized on the surface, but with an underlying structure of pure, formidable intellect. He sat behind his cluttered desk, a man in his late 60s with a shock of untamed white hair and eyes that, despite the thick spectacles perched on his nose, seemed to see right through to the core of a person. He listened to Alara's story without interruption, his hands steepled beneath his chin, his expression shifting from scholarly curiosity to a slow-burning, righteous indignation that seemed to warm the very air in the room. As Alara recounted the events at the Gilded Scepter, she did so with the clinical precision she had learned in her academic training, laying out the facts, the observations, the psychological triggers she had employed with Leo. She spoke of Marco Valeriano's dismissiveness, his casual cruelty, and the final, damning words she had overheard on his phone call. She did not cry. Her voice did not waver. The cold, solid core of purpose within her had burned away the need for tears. She was a scientist presenting her findings, a case study in corporate sociopathy and its devastating human cost. When she finished, a profound silence settled over the room, broken only by the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner, each tick a second of stolen time being counted. Dr. Finch slowly removed his glasses and polished them with a handkerchief, a deliberate, thoughtful gesture. When he put them back on, his gaze was no longer just that of a mentor. It was the look of an ally, a fellow soldier enlisting in a just war. He saw not the disgraced waitress sitting before him, but the brilliant researcher he had once mentored, a mind he had believed was lost to the world, now reforged in the crucible of suffering into something even stronger. The investigation began not with a bang, but with the quiet rustle of paper and the low hum of a computer monitor in the university's cavernous library archives. The first week was a descent into a maddening labyrinth of corporate filings, shareholder reports, and sanitized press releases from 5 years prior. The official story of the Vance Engineering acquisition was a masterpiece of legal maneuvering, a clean, bloodless narrative of a smaller, inefficient company being absorbed by a larger, more dynamic entity for the good of the market. There was no sign of foul play, no obvious red flag. Every document was perfectly in order, every signature accounted for. They spent nights fueled by lukewarm coffee from a vending machine, their faces illuminated by the pale blue glow of microfiche readers, sifting through mountains of data that told them nothing. Ilara felt a gnawing frustration, a sense of hitting a wall of polished, impenetrable granite. It was a fortress of legality built to hide a moral crime, and she felt the ghost of her father's despair settling over her. He had been an engineer, a man who believed in rules, in physics, in the predictable and honorable conduct of business. He never would have stood a chance against a predator who rewrote the rules to suit his own hunt. Dr. Finch, however, was undeterred. He was a man who understood that the most important truths are often found not in the official documents, but in the spaces between the lines, in the stories that are never written down. He began making calls, tapping into a network of former students, colleagues, and contacts cultivated over 40 years in academia and public advocacy. He was searching for a ghost, a whisper, anyone who had been close enough to the Valeriano machine to see its inner workings and had been cast out. The search was a series of dead ends. People were afraid. The name Valeriano carried a weight that slammed doors and ended phone calls abruptly. The man's influence was a web of money, power, and intimidation that extended far beyond his corporate headquarters. For every person Finch called, it seemed 2 more warned him to drop his inquiry, to let sleeping dragons lie. The process was grueling, a slow chipping away at a mountain of fear. Ilara watched him, her respect for her old mentor deepening with every failed attempt. He was tireless, his belief in her and her cause a steady flame in the growing darkness of their search. He was fighting for the very principles he had taught her, that truth matters, and that no one, no matter how powerful, is above being held to account. The breakthrough came from the most unexpected of sources. It wasn't a high-powered executive or a disgruntled board member. It was a name given to Finch by a retired financial journalist he'd once consulted for a book. Julian Croft, a mid-level IT systems administrator who had been fired from Valeriano's private equity firm, Titan Capital, 4 years ago. The reason for his termination was officially listed as redundancy, but the journalist hinted at a different story, one of a man who saw something he wasn't supposed to see. Finding Julian was another challenge. He had seemingly dropped off the face of the earth, his digital footprint all but erased. But Ilara, using the research skills she had honed for her thesis, found him. She cross-referenced old employee newsletters with public property records and voter registration databases, a painstaking process of digital archaeology. She eventually found an address in a quiet, unassuming suburb in Queens, a place as far removed from the glittering towers of Manhattan as one could get. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble based on a single whispered rumor, but it was the only lead they had. The meeting with Julian Croft took place in a small, greasy spoon diner that smelled of burnt coffee and regret. He was a man haunted by his past, his eyes constantly darting towards the door, his hands trembling as he stirred his cup of coffee, creating a frantic vortex in the black liquid. He was thin, pale, and looked a decade older than the 45 years his records indicated. He was terrified. At first he denied everything, claiming he knew nothing, that his termination was exactly as it appeared in the records. But Ilara did not press him. She didn't threaten or cajole. Instead, she simply told him her story. She spoke of her father, of the brilliant, kind man he had been before his life's work was stolen from him. She spoke of the antiseptic smell of the care facility and the crushing weight of the medical bills. She did not ask for evidence or secrets. She simply bore witness to the human cost of the number on a spreadsheet that had ended his career. She connected with him not as an investigator, but as a fellow victim of the same soulless machine. Julian listened, his frantic stirring slowing until his hand was still. He saw in Ilara's face, not a threat, but a reflection of his own buried conscience. He had been a good man, a man who had been proud of his work, until he was asked to do something that broke him. He finally looked up from his coffee, his eyes meeting hers, and the fear in them was now mingled with a flicker of defiance. He told her that before he was fired, he had been tasked with a data migration project. He was told to transfer all files related to several recently acquired companies, including Vance Engineering, to a secure off-site server, and then to perform a deep scrub of the local network drives, erasing all traces of the original files. It was framed as a routine security upgrade, but he knew it was a burial. The process was designed to make any future legal discovery nearly impossible. It was a digital cremation of evidence. He had seen memos, internal emails, and risk assessments that were never meant to see the light of day, documents that painted a picture of a deliberate predatory strategy to devalue Vance Engineering before the takeover. He hadn't made copies. He was too scared, too aware of the consequences. But he had a systems administrator's memory. He couldn't give her the documents, but he could give her a map. He told her about the off-site server, a nondescript data storage facility in New Jersey, a digital fortress with biometric security. But he also told her about a loophole, a flaw in the system he had noticed but never reported. Marco Valeriano, in his supreme arrogance, insisted on having a direct, high-speed access terminal in his own office, a personal backdoor into his digital empire that bypassed several of the standard security protocols. If someone could get to that terminal, even for a few minutes, they could potentially access the dead files on the New Jersey server. He drew a crude map on a napkin, his hand still trembling, but his lines now firm. He gave her the server address, the root directory name, Lithe, named after the river of forgetfulness in Greek mythology, and the specific command line prompts needed to initiate a search. It was everything. It was the key to the tomb. Now they had a target, but it was located in the most inaccessible place imaginable, Marco Valeriano's personal office on the top floor of Titan Capital. A direct assault was impossible. This was where Ilara's true genius came to the forefront. She couldn't be a hacker or a spy, but she could be what she had always been, an astute observer of human behavior. She began a new kind of investigation, a deep dive into the life and habits of Marco Valeriano. She studied his public appearances, charity donations, and the society pages. She discovered his one acceptable passion outside of business, collecting rare, modern art. He saw it not as a source of beauty but as another class of asset, a way to project an image of sophistication and culture. He was known to be acquiring pieces for his new corporate headquarters, a project overseen by a prestigious art consulting firm. This was her way in. She would not be a waitress or a therapist. She would become an art historian. The plan was audacious, bordering on insane. Ilara spent the next 2 weeks at the university library, not in the archives but in the fine arts section. She devoured books on post-war abstract expressionism, the specific school of art Valeriano favored. She memorized the names of artists, the provenance of key pieces, the jargon of the auction houses. She created a new identity for herself, Lena Petrova, a freelance art consultant and research assistant. Dr. Finch used his university credentials to lend her an air of legitimacy, creating a plausible backstory and even a temporary academic email address. The final piece of the puzzle was securing a meeting. Through a carefully worded email to the lead consulting firm, she offered pro bono research assistance on a particularly obscure artist she knew Valeriano was trying to acquire, a gesture framed as a young academic trying to make a name for herself. To her astonishment, they accepted. They were overworked and happy to offload a tedious research task. She was given a temporary visitor's pass and a 1-hour appointment to present her findings at the Titan Capitol building. Walking into the lobby of Titan Capitol was like stepping into the heart of the beast. The air was cold, sterile, and smelled faintly of metal and ozone. The space was a monument to brutalist architecture and corporate power, all polished black granite, chrome, and smoked glass. People moved with a clipped, anxious energy, their faces illuminated by the glow of their smartphones. Alara, dressed in a simple but elegant black dress, her hair pulled back in a professional bun, felt a tremor of fear, a primal instinct to turn and run. But then she thought of her father, of his gentle strength, and the fear was replaced by a cold, sharp focus. She was Lena Petrova. She was a professional. She was invisible in a different way now, hidden in plain sight behind a mask of competence and ambition that everyone in this building would recognize and respect. She was escorted to the top floor, the elevator rising with a silent, sickening speed, each floor a step deeper into enemy territory. The art consultant she was meeting was a woman named Cassandra, a sharp, impeccably dressed professional who was more interested in the investment potential of a painting than its aesthetic value. Lara played her part perfectly. She presented her research with a quiet confidence, peppering her speech with the exact terminology she knew would impress Cassandra. She was knowledgeable but not arrogant, helpful but not subservient. She earned her trust in minutes. As the meeting wound down, Alara executed the riskiest part of her plan. She feigned a sudden dizzy spell, blaming it on having skipped lunch. She spilled a glass of water, not on any paperwork, but on her own blouse, creating a plausible, slightly embarrassing distraction. As Cassandra fussed, offering to get her some paper towels from the pantry down the hall, Alara knew she had, at most, 90 seconds. It was a lifetime. The moment Cassandra left the conference room, Alara moved. She didn't run. Her movements were fluid and efficient. She slipped out of the conference room and into the hallway. Valeriano's office was just 20 feet away, its large glass doors slightly ajar. She had seen him leave for a lunch meeting when she first arrived. Her heart was a frantic hammer against her ribs, but her hands were rock steady. She slipped inside. The office was breathtaking in its austerity and opulence. A single, massive mahogany desk sat before a floor-to-ceiling window that offered a god-king's view of the city below. On the desk was the terminal Julian had described. It was a sleek, black machine, humming with latent power. She didn't hesitate. She sat in his chair, the leather cool against her skin, and her fingers flew across the keyboard. She didn't need to guess a password. As Julian had predicted, Valeriano's arrogance was his weakness. The direct access terminal was on a trusted network, requiring only a simple biometric thumbprint scan to awaken, a feature she bypassed by plugging in a small USB device Finch had procured, which spoofed a security administrator's credentials for a precious few minutes. The screen flickered to life, displaying a stark, black command line interface. She typed in the server address, the root directory name, Lethe, and the search command Julian had given her. Her fingers moved with an unnatural speed, the muscle memory from years of academic research taking over. She initiated a search for any files containing the name Vance. For a terrifying moment, nothing happened. The cursor just blinked, a tiny, mocking green square. She could hear the sound of Cassandra's heels clicking back down the hallway. Her time was up. She was about to abort, to pull the drive and run, when the screen suddenly flooded with text. A list of files appeared, dozens of them, all locked in the digital tomb. Memos, emails, internal audits, and one file that made her blood run cold. Project Nightingale _risk_assessment_final.pdf. She knew, with an absolute certainty born of instinct, that this was it. She didn't have time to open it. With 2 seconds to spare, she dragged the file, along with a dozen others, onto the encrypted flash drive, ejected it, and slipped it into her pocket just as Cassandra re-entered the conference room, paper towels in hand. Later that night, back in the safety of Dr. Finch's office, they opened the files. What they found was worse than they could have possibly imagined. It was a meticulous, cold-blooded blueprint for the utter destruction of Vance Engineering. The memos detailed a strategy to short the company's stock, to spread false rumors of insolvency, and to poach key employees to create an atmosphere of panic. But the Project Nightingale file was the true smoking gun. It was a suppressed geological and environmental report, commissioned by her own father, which revealed that a piece of land owned by Vance Engineering sat atop a massive, previously undiscovered deposit of rare earth minerals. Her father had planned to partner with an environmental group to ensure it was extracted ethically, with minimal impact. Valeriano's firm had discovered this through corporate espionage, and their entire strategy was designed to acquire the company for pennies on the dollar before the report could be made public. They hadn't just bought a company, they had stolen a fortune, a legacy, and they had done it by destroying a good man. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Now they had the proof, the irrefutable, damning evidence of a crime far greater than predatory finance. It was fraud on a colossal scale. But simply leaking it to the press wasn't enough. A man like Valeriano had an army of lawyers and public relations experts who could spin any story, who could bury the truth in a blizzard of lawsuits and counter-accusations. Alara knew that justice for her father required more than just a newspaper headline. It required a public reckoning. It required a stage. And she knew exactly which one to use. Dr. Finch found the announcement online. The Valeriano Foundation's annual Miracle Makers Gala, a lavish, high-profile charity event benefiting the city's largest children's hospital. It was Marco's crown jewel of public philanthropy. The night he played the role of the city's benevolent savior, it was the perfect stage for his unmasking. The plan was forged in the quiet, late-night hours, a strategy as meticulous and precise as the one Valeriano had used to destroy her family. Dr. Finch secured 2 tickets to the gala through a university donor. An investigative journalist, a protege of Finch's old friend, was brought into the circle. He would be their validator, ready to break the story the moment the evidence was made public. Alara would not be an accuser shouting from the sidelines. She would be a guest. She would confront him on his own turf, during his keynote address. The moment of his greatest manufactured glory. She held the flash drive in her hand, the cold metal, a tangible weight of the truth it contained. The invisible waitress, the forgotten academic, the grieving daughter, all of those identities had been burned away. In their place was a woman holding the instrument of justice. The stage was set. The king was on his throne, unaware that a ghost from one of his forgotten conquests was walking through the gates of his castle, ready for the final move. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was not a room, it was a living testament to the power of curated perception. The air itself seemed to glitter, thick, with the intermingled scents of night-blooming jasmine flown in from the tropics and the crisp, expensive perfume clinging to the silks and velvets of the city's elite. A string quartet played Vivaldi from a gilded balcony, their music a delicate, shimmering thread woven into the tapestry of hushed, important conversations. Light from a dozen chandeliers, each one a constellation of hand-cut crystal, rained down upon the assembled guests, catching on the cold fire of diamonds at throats and wrists, and glinting off the surface of thousands of glasses of champagne. This was Marco Valeriano's cathedral, the annual Miracle Makers Gala, a monument he had built to his own public virtue. Moving through this glittering jungle was Alara Vance. She wore a simple, sleeveless black dress, a column of midnight in a sea of jewel tones. It was not a costume of servitude, but a uniform of intent. In her hand, she carried a slim, black leather portfolio. She felt the gaze of the crowd slide over her and dismiss her, and she welcomed it. Invisibility was still her greatest weapon. Beside her, Dr. Alistair Finch was a comforting, rumpled anchor of reality, his academic tweed a quiet rebellion against the sea of tuxedos. Across the room, she saw the journalist, David Chen, give her a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. Every piece was in place. Her heart was not pounding with fear, but with a slow, powerful, and steady rhythm, like a drum beating the advance for a battle already won. Marco Valeriano took the stage to a wave of thunderous applause. The spotlight found him, carving him out of the darkness, and he bathed in its warmth like a lizard on a hot rock. He was a master of this stage, his bespoke tuxedo fitting him like a second skin, his smile a carefully calibrated instrument of charm and power. He approached the lectern, placing his hands on either side, a benevolent king surveying his loyal subjects. His voice, when he spoke, was a marvel of acoustic engineering, a rich, resonant baritone that wrapped the audience in a blanket of sincerity. He spoke of his humble beginnings, a carefully constructed myth that bore no resemblance to his privileged upbringing. He spoke of the sacred duty of the fortunate to care for the vulnerable. He spoke of family, of the values instilled in him by his sainted mother, of the legacy he hoped to build for his own son. With every perfectly delivered lie, Alara felt the cold purpose inside her sharpened to a razor's edge. In her mind's eye, she saw the sterile beige walls of her father's room, heard the rhythmic, lonely beep of his heart monitor. She felt the phantom weight of the $7,000 medical bills in her hand. This man was using the very concepts he had desecrated: family, legacy, compassion, as a shield. He was hiding his monstrosity behind a wall of philanthropic bricks, and she was here to tear it down, one stone at a time. As his speech reached its emotional peak, as he painted a picture of a brighter future for the city's children, he paused, letting the weight of his feigned sincerity settle over the rapt audience. He was waiting for the inevitable standing ovation, the validation that his money had so effectively purchased. It was in that perfect, suspended moment of self-congratulation that Alara began to move. She did not run or shout. Her steps were unhurried, a deliberate, measured procession down the plush carpet of the center aisle. A few heads turned, then a few more. A ripple of confusion spread through the ballroom, a dissonant note in the carefully composed symphony of the evening. Security guards, large men in ill-fitting suits, saw her and began to move from the periphery, their expressions hardening. But Dr. Finch stepped into their path, a small academic bulldog blocking the way. He didn't raise his voice. He simply spoke with the unshakable authority of a tenured professor, presenting his invitation and murmuring something about a scheduled presentation. His intervention created a crucial 3-second window of hesitation. It was all Alara needed. She reached the foot of the stage and stopped, her gaze fixed on the man in the spotlight. Marco's smile faltered, a hairline crack in the marble facade. He squinted, a flicker of annoyance crossing his features. He saw a woman, a disruption, a problem to be managed. He did not see the ghost of his past, the arbiter of his future. He opened his mouth to deliver a witty, dismissive remark, to have this nobody quietly removed. But Alara spoke first. Her voice, unamplified, was quiet, yet it sliced through the expectant silence of the vast ballroom with the clarity of a ringing bell. Mr. Valeriano. The name hung in the air, a simple statement of fact. He froze, the dismissive quip dying on his lips. You speak so eloquently of legacy. She continued, her tone even devoid of the tremor of rage or fear he might have expected. It was the calm, clinical tone of a diagnostician. She opened the black leather portfolio she carried. The object she removed was not a sheaf of papers or a legal document. It was a simple, elegant, black frame. Inside it was a child's drawing. She turned it, not for the audience to see, but holding it up as if presenting evidence to the heavens. Her true signal was for the small team David Chen had assembled in the audio-visual booth at the back of the room. On the massive screen behind Marco, the glowing logo of the Miracle Makers Gala suddenly vanished, replaced by a high-definition, screen-filling image of the drawing. A collective, audible gasp, like the sound of 1,000 lungs emptying at once, swept through the room. The portrait of Isabella Valeriano, rendered with impossible love and detail by her son's hand, gazed out over the stunned crowd, a silent, beautiful accusation. Marco spun around, and his face, projected in pristine detail on the smaller monitors flanking the stage, turned the color of ash. He was staring at his dead wife, resurrected by the hand of a son he had given up on, broadcast at the very moment of his greatest triumph. And he knew, with the sickening certainty of a man falling from a great height, exactly who this woman was. The silence in the room was now absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket. Every eye was on Alara, on Marco, on the ghost on the screen. "This," Alara said, her voice now resonating with a profound, sorrowful power that seemed to fill every corner of the space, "is the only true legacy you have left. A memory of love, preserved in the heart of a son you dismissed. A memory unlocked not by your billions of dollars, but by the empathy of a woman whose life you destroyed to make them." The words landed like hammer blows, shattering the fragile glass of Marco's public persona. He stumbled back, his hand instinctively going to his chest as if to ward off a physical assault. The name. He needed her name, but she gave it freely. "My name is Alara Vance." She let the name settle in the air, a seed of truth planted in the fertile ground of his public humiliation. "I am the daughter of Arthur Vance. Does the name Vance Engineering mean anything to you, Mr. Valeriano?" Marco's face, a canvas of horror, was his only answer. "Or perhaps you'd recognize the name of your internal file for the acquisition." She pressed on, her voice cold and precise. "Project Nightingale." As she spoke the final word, 100 tiny lights blinked on across the darkened ballroom. The guests, the power brokers, the philanthropists, were looking at their phones. On each screen was the headline from David Chen's news alert, sent the very second she spoke the project's name: Titan Capital CEO Marco Valeriano, implicated in multi-billion-dollar fraud and asset-stripping scheme. Suppressed. Project Nightingale. Report reveals all. The trap was not just sprung. It was a cage of his own making, and it had slammed shut. The downfall was not a slow decline. It was a catastrophic collapse, a supernova of shame. Marco Valeriano did not scream or rage. A low, guttural sound escaped his throat, the sound of a man whose soul had just been ripped from his body. He stared out at the sea of faces, faces that had looked at him with adoration just moments before, and now saw only a monster. He saw the cold, accusatory lenses of the press cameras, capturing his ruin for eternity. His phone, which he had left on the lectern, began to buzz with a frantic, unending vibration, a frantic chorus of his lawyers, his board members, his entire world calling to tell him what he already knew, that he was finished. The benevolent king, the titan of industry, the miracle maker, had been undone, not by a corporate raider with a bigger war chest, not by a market crash, but by a quiet waitress he had deemed too insignificant to even look at. He was alone on that stage, bathed in the unforgiving glare of the spotlight, a man stripped of everything but his guilt, haunted by the beautiful face of the wife he had failed and the ghost of the good man he had destroyed. His empire had been built on a foundation of forgotten victims, and one of them had just returned to claim the debt. Type "Justice" in the comments if you got chills when Alara Vance finally exposed the truth. The months that followed were a blur of headlines, investigations, and the slow, grinding work of dismantling a fallen empire. Marco Valeriano was consumed by a maelstrom of federal lawsuits and regulatory hearings, his name becoming a byword for corporate greed and moral bankruptcy. But the world's attention, fickle as it was, soon found its new hero. The story of the invisible waitress who had single-handedly toppled a titan was irresistible. Ilara, however, wanted no part of the fame. She gave one interview, to David Chen, in which she told her father's story, not her own. Then she disappeared from the public eye. One evening, a few weeks after the gala, she was visited by an elderly man, a quiet industrialist named George Sterling, who had been in the audience that night. His own wife had suffered a stroke years ago, and he had spent a fortune on her care. He told Ilara that he was moved not by her revenge, but by her profound gift. He had not seen a quest for vengeance that night. He had seen a brilliant therapist at work. He wanted to fund her dream, not as a charity, but as an investment in a better world. He wanted to help her build. The groundbreaking ceremony for the Vance Center for Therapeutic Arts took place on a bright, crisp autumn morning on a plot of land overlooking the Hudson River. The air smelled of damp earth and new beginnings. Ilara stood at a simple wooden podium, not in a uniform or a borrowed dress, but in clothes that were simply her own. She looked out at the small crowd. Dr. Finch, beaming with pride. David Chen, his notebook for once put away. George Sterling, who stood quietly at the back, a gentle smile on his face. In the front row sat her father, Arthur Vance, in his wheelchair. He could not speak, but his eyes, clear and bright, were fixed on his daughter, and in them was a universe of love and pride. A little to his side sat Leo Valeriano, his legal guardianship now managed by a compassionate aunt. He was not looking at the crowd. He was looking at the sky, a large sketchbook open on his lap, his hand moving furiously, capturing the exact shape and color of a passing cloud. Ilara spoke not of the past, of ruin, or of justice served. She spoke of the future, of the silent languages of the heart, and of the power of art to build bridges across the deepest divides. She had faced the monster who had destroyed her family, and in defeating him, had refused to become one herself. She had taken her pain, her grief, and her righteous fury, and she had built something new. She had honored her father's name not by tearing down an empire of greed, but by creating a sanctuary of healing, a true and lasting legacy of hope. If Ilara Vance's incredible journey from underdog to powerhouse inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see it. And for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell.